At the very beginning of the brutal and bloody invasion of the Soviet Union, the 4th Panzer Group, led by the experienced and ambitious General Erich Hoepner, with incredible speed and power, broke through the powerful defenses of the Northwestern Front, like a red-hot knife entering soft butter. The 41st Motorized Corps of this group, displaying unprecedented offensive force and tactical superiority, crushed 2 rifle divisions of the Red Army, leaving them no chance for effective resistance. After this crushing victory, the German troops, without losing a minute of precious time, occupied the strategically important city of Torridge, thereby securing a bridgehead for their further advance. Without stopping there, they continued their victorious offensive towards the strategically important city of Ruzhnyi, preparing for new battles and trials that awaited them ahead. On the morning of June 23rd, when the first rays of the sun were just beginning to break through the morning mist, the 2nd Tank Division of the Red Army, showing courage and determination, entered an unequal battle with the superior forces of the 6th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet division was armed with about 250 tanks, an impressive force that was supposed to resist the enemy, among which were about 50 heavy KV-1 tanks, which were the pride of the Soviet tank industry and embodied power and invincibility. The heavy KV tanks, like steel giants from ancient myths, immediately demonstrated their overwhelming superiority on the battlefield, becoming almost invulnerable to ordinary German anti-tank guns. These invulnerable machines could only be hit using the most powerful 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which further emphasized their exceptional protection and invulnerability on the battlefield. The Germans, faced with such power, were forced to retreat, thrown back by the crushing power of Soviet tanks. However, this counterattack, despite its initial and impressive success, quickly lost its power and offensive impulse, as if exhausted, as it encountered a numerically and firepower superior enemy. In support of the 6th Panzer Division, which had suffered significant losses in this battle, several divisions of large-caliber artillery were immediately dispatched, capable of unleashing a deadly barrage of fire on the enemy, as well as an entire regiment of rocket launchers, which were supposed to demoralize the enemy with a hail of exploding shells. Aviation was also actively used, constantly bombarding Soviet positions, trying to break their desperate resistance and bring chaos into their ranks. In the following 2 days of fierce and bloody battles, Soviet tankers suffered heavy losses, facing the relentless onslaught of a superior enemy, and experiencing an acute shortage of fuel and ammunition, which seriously limited their combat capabilities and hampered their actions. In these difficult and unbearable conditions, they were forced to switch to defensive actions, retreating step by step under the onslaught of superior forces that methodically and relentlessly pressed them. By June 26, as a result of continuous and exhausting battles, the division found itself in a semi-encirclement, becoming an easy target for German artillery and aviation, which literally showered them with a barrage of fire. In this tragic and heavy battle, its brave commander, Major General Salyankin, who bravely fought alongside his soldiers until the last moment, setting them an example of courage and heroism, died. Communication with the Army headquarters was completely lost, and the surviving soldiers of the division, continuing to fight with relentless persistence, began to retreat to the east, trying to avoid total annihilation and maintain at least some combat-capable forces. This fierce battle, which unfolded near the Lithuanian city of Ruzhnyi, is considered the first major tank battle in the Great Patriotic War, where significant tank formations were used on both sides, demonstrating a new era in warfare to the whole world and foreshadowing the large-scale tank battles of the future. One incredible and heroic episode went down in the history of this battle, which over time turned into a true legend of courage, steadfastness, and unprecedented heroism. A single KV-1 tank, showing inhuman steadfastness and steely endurance, managed to block the only road that served as the main supply line for the German 6th Panzer Division, thereby seriously disrupting its logistics and thwarting all plans for further advance. This tank single-handedly confronted an entire division and held it under control for almost 2 days, which became a vivid example of the outstanding heroism and tactical skill of Soviet tank crews terrifying the enemy. The details of this incredible and heroic 2-day battle of a single, also immobilized tank against the considerable forces and equipment of this division became known only after the end of the war, when memoirs and memories of the participants in those distant and tragic events were published. The commander of this German group, Colonel Erhard Raus, described all the events in detail in his memoirs, shedding light on this dramatic and at the same time heroic episode and revealing many previously unknown facts. At about 12 noon on June 24th, when the sun was at its zenith, a Soviet KV-1 tank appeared a couple of kilometers from the city on the road that ran north from Rzyni, unexpectedly and as if out of nowhere. How it got there remains a mystery to this day, shrouded in darkness and mystery. Perhaps it had fallen behind its main group due to some minor technical malfunction that its crew had managed to fix on its own. Or perhaps it had gotten lost in unfamiliar territory and got into this trap. We will never know this, and all these details will forever remain a secret that time has taken away. It stopped like a motionless idol, right in the middle of the road, blocking it completely and thereby creating a serious problem for the German troops. Why it chose such an open and clearly unsuitable place for defense became clear only later, when all the circumstances became known, and the puzzle came together into a single picture. Historian and writer Maxim Kolomaitz, having done a huge and painstaking job, not only accurately established the place where these tragic events unfolded, but also managed to find eyewitnesses of those distant and difficult days who were still alive. One of them, a teenager at the time, recalled that Soviet tankers came to their farm, which was a kilometer from the frozen tank, and asked for help. They asked if there was an MTS machine and tractor station, or any warehouse nearby where they could get fuel for their fighting machine. Unfortunately, they did not manage to obtain the necessary fuel, but the tankers were not going to abandon their working machine, and even more so with full ammunition, under any circumstances, with firm determination and unbending will, they returned to their steel tank, ready to accept the battle and fight the enemy to the last bullet, to the end. At first, when Raus learned about the tank that blocked the road, he decided that it was most likely the beginning of a Russian counterattack, which prompted him to mobilize his forces and be on alert. However, the reconnaissance quickly confirmed that apart from this lone tank, no other tanks or units of the Red Army were found in the area, which made him think. But this news did not bring relief to the German command. On the contrary, it worried them even more, since the enemy's plan was not clear to them. As Raus writes in his detailed memoirs, describing this dramatic situation, it was necessary to immediately take all necessary measures to destroy this dangerous obstacle, which posed a serious threat to our advance, as soon as possible, or at least push this Russian tank away from the road, and thereby restore the disrupted logistics. With its precise and devastating fire, it had already set fire to 12 supply trucks that were heading to us from Rzyni with much-needed ammunition, provisions, and medicines. And now they were burning brightly. We were forced to suspend the evacuation of the wounded in the battles for the bridgehead, and as a result, several people who received serious injuries died without receiving the necessary medical care, including a young lieutenant who was shot at point-blank range and could have survived if he had been evacuated to the hospital in time. All our attempts to bypass this tank were completely unsuccessful. Our vehicles either got stuck in the impassable mud or ran into scattered Russian units that were still wandering in the forest and resisting. Please support my channel by liking and subscribing to it, so you can continue to enjoy exciting and truthful stories about World War II and hear the opinions of all participants in those distant and tragic events from different points of view. Attempt number 1. In order to destroy this recalcitrant tank, which posed a serious threat, Rouse immediately sent a battery of newly received, state-of-the-art 50mm anti-tank guns in a battle, which were believed to be able to penetrate the armor of any tank. They managed to occupy advantageous and strategically important positions, only 600 meters from the tank, which, according to the Germans' calculations, guaranteed them an undeniable success. The distance was deadly, and no one doubted that the tank would be destroyed in the very near future. However, in practice, the most powerful anti-tank guns of the Wehrmacht did not live up to the expectations placed on them, proving their ineffectiveness against the powerful and impenetrable armor of the Soviet KV-1 tank, which turned out to be an insurmountable obstacle. The tank seemed to not react to our shots at all, as if it was made of steel, until our guns achieved 8 direct hits, which should have destroyed it. Then, as if awakening from a long sleep, its turret slowly but surely turned, like a hunter tracking its prey, and accurately found its target. After that, it began to systematically destroy our guns one by one, with single shots from its powerful 80mm gun, which pierced the armor like cardboard. 2 of our 50mm guns were torn to pieces, turning into a pile of mangled scrap metal, while the other 2 were severely damaged and their repair was impossible. The personnel suffered significant losses in killed and wounded, which plunged us into despair and shock, the colonel recalls bitterly. The damaged guns could only be pulled from the battlefield at nightfall, and until that moment, the situation remained critical, on the verge of disaster, and the German soldiers were desperate. The tanks still continued to block the road, completely paralyzing the supply of the entire combat group, which seriously jeopardized the further advance of German troops and the success of the entire operation. Attempt number 2. The Germans, not wanting to give up and having no intention of retreating, tried to shell this invulnerable tank with a 150mm howitzer, which was considered one of the most powerful guns in their arsenal and capable of destroying any tank. However, they did not risk pulling this gun, which German soldiers loved so much for the enormous explosive power of its shell, to direct fire, fearing to come under return fire. And the high-angle fire they were firing from a distance was not particularly accurate, which played its role. They failed to achieve a direct hit, and even nearby explosions did not cause any noticeable damage to the tank, causing only sparks to fly from its strong armor. The Germans had to abandon further and useless shelling with the howitzer, recognizing its ineffectiveness in this difficult and non-standard situation, and began to look for another solution. Attempt number 3. After several unsuccessful and failed attempts, it became quite obvious that without an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, with its heavy armor-piercing shells, it would be impossible to defeat this invulnerable tank under any circumstances. In the afternoon, such a gun was finally delivered from Rosinii, which filled the German soldiers with new hope for a quick success, and they were uplifted. It was assumed that the effect of its use could be achieved from a distance of 2 kilometers, but the thick and black smoke rising from the burning trucks almost completely hid the tank, making aiming extremely difficult and almost impossible. Deciding that this same smoke would serve as a kind of shelter for the artillerymen, the Germans pulled the gun closer, to a distance of about 500 meters. At the same time, the tank still showed no activity, as if it did not notice them and did not pay any attention to them. Its turret was still turned to the north, from where the first attack had started, which made the Germans optimistically believe that luck was finally on their side. And this time they would definitely be lucky, but the Soviet tankers, showing cunning and tactical training, outwitted them once again and thwarted all plans. Knowing perfectly well what the Germans were up to, they did not prevent the artillerymen from pulling the gun closer. The anti-aircraft gun could not fire from its wheels and was safe, but it took some time to bring it into combat position, which the Soviet tankers used, who were in full combat readiness. Next, let us give the floor to Erhard Rouse himself, who was an eyewitness to these tragic and dramatic events. A decisive and critical moment came in this fierce and tense battle of nerves, when the crew, with strained and focused faces, began preparing the anti-aircraft gun to fire. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, for the tank crew, it was time to act, and they did not waste it. While the artillerymen, terribly nervous, were aiming and loading the gun, the tank suddenly turned its turret and fired first. Each of its shells accurately hit its target, striking the German guns. The severely damaged anti-aircraft gun fell into the ditch as it fell. Several men of the crew died without even realizing what had happened, and the others, saving their lives, were forced to flee, leaving their weapons behind. The machine gun fire from the tank did not allow the damaged gun to be recovered, and so it remained lying in the ditch, becoming a hopeless trophy. Overall, the first day of fighting ended extremely unsuccessfully for the attackers, bringing only disappointment and loss of morale. Not only did the tank remain intact, but we also had to eat dry rations since unfortunately it was not possible to bring up the field kitchen, and the soldiers were hungry, according to Rouse. Such a situation did not add to the optimism of the German soldiers, and their morale dropped significantly, and many were in despair. Attempt number 4. After the artillerymen admitted their inability to cope with this problem and were powerless against the Soviet tank, the sappers decided to take matters into their own hands, who were believed to be able to solve any task and overcome any obstacle. 12 volunteers were selected who, under the cover of night, were supposed to sneak up to the tank and, having planted explosives, blow it up, hoping that this would be the end of the story. But this seemingly simple and easy operation went completely off plan and turned into a real nightmare. When the sappers, stealthily and trying to be inconspicuous, moving along the side of the road, approached the tank quite closely, several shadows suddenly darted towards it from the opposite side, which frightened them extremely. There was a knock on the tank's armor, voices were heard, and a hatch opened, which plunged the Germans into real shock. It turned out that these were locals who, risking their lives, brought food and water to Soviet tankers, wishing to help them in this unequal struggle. Fearing to frighten the tankers and disrupt the entire operation, the sappers were forced to lie in the ditch for more than an hour until the locals left, and the tankers, according to their calculations, fell asleep and lost vigilance. 2 explosive charges were placed on the tank's hull, one on the track and the other on the armor plate of the hull, hoping that this would be quite enough for its complete destruction. After a few seconds, a powerful and deafening explosion tore through the night silence, shaking everything around and making the ground tremble. The task was completed, and the sappers decided with relief that they had achieved a decisive success, and now everything would be over. However, as soon as the echo of the explosion had subsided among the trees, the tank's machine gun came to life and bullets whistled around, forcing the sappers to lie on the ground and save themselves from the deadly fire. The tank itself remained motionless, like a monument to itself. Its track was probably broken by the explosion, but it was impossible to find out since the machine gun was firing wildly and inaccurately, not allowing anyone to approach. Lieutenant Gebhardt and his patrol returned to the bridgehead noticeably depressed and disappointed, and their hopes for an easy victory had been dashed. Now they were no longer sure of the success of this operation. The colonel writes bitterly in his memoirs. Attempt number 5 failed. By the morning of June 25th, the situation had escalated to the limit, and the situation became critical as never before. The division, left without supplies, began to have serious and insoluble problems that jeopardized the entire further operation. The offensive actually stopped, and serious doubts began to arise as to whether it would be able to fulfill its combat missions at all without timely replenishment of ammunition and fuel supplies, which was extremely necessary. The tank had to be destroyed at any cost, and any delay could lead to disaster. The desperate Rouse, seeing no other way out of the situation, called in Ju-87 dive bombers, hoping that they could finally solve this problem and put an end to this tank. However, according to the strict German management system, the Luftwaffe units, although they were assigned to tank groups, did not report to ground command, but made their decisions independently, and Goering's aces believed that they had much more important tasks on the front lines than bombing a single tank in the rear of the enemy, which posed no threat to them. In addition, they had serious doubts that they would be able to achieve a direct hit, and nearby explosions posed no danger to. This tank and the crew, as it turned out, had nerves as strong as steel, and they could not be broken. In short, the command categorically refused to support the Air Force to the colonel, recommending that he manage with his own considerable forces and look for other ways to solve this problem. Attempt number 6. Erhard Rouse was forced to resort to the last plan he had invented, although he was very reluctant to do so and feared possible consequences. The thing is that he did not guarantee absolute success, but the losses in its implementation could be very serious and significant. The plan was to organize a feigned tank attack on this invulnerable enemy, under the cover of which they would try once again to pull the 88mm anti-aircraft gun closer to it, which was done at great risk to the lives of German soldiers. In this difficult and extremely dangerous operation, he used an entire tank battalion and put them in harm's way. The maneuverable Czech PZKW 38T tanks began to intensively shell the KV-1 from all sides, trying to distract its attention and lure it out of its shelter. With their 37mm guns, they obviously could not penetrate its armor, but they acted very irritatingly, provoking return fire and creating danger for the tank crew. Perhaps the KV crew was afraid that a chance hit would break the triplexes or jam the turret, which would make the tank unusable. In short, the KV began to actively fire back, shifting fire from one target to another and exhausting the enemy. Rouse's plan worked, and he described the heroic death of the tank as follows. To our great happiness, the Russians were seized with fighting zeal and completely stopped watching their rear, from where real trouble was approaching them, which could be their last. The anti-aircraft gun took up a position near the same place where such a gun had already been destroyed the day before, and the Germans had already realized that this was a dangerous place. Its menacing barrel was aimed directly at the tank, and the first shot was heard, shaking the air and deafening everyone. Around the wounded KV, one tried to turn its turret back, but the anti-aircraft gunners managed to fire 2 more shots during this time and did not give the tank the slightest chance of rescue. The turret stopped rotating, but the tank, contrary to our expectations, did not catch fire, although we no longer hoped for it, although the enemy no longer reacted to our fire. After 2 days of failures, we still could not believe in our success and feared a new attack. For more shots were fired with armor-piercing shells from the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, which finally managed to penetrate the thick armor of this monster and cause irreparable damage to it. Its gun was raised helplessly upward, and it became clear that this was the end. However, as it turned out, this was not the end of this incredible and heroic story either, which made the Germans believe in the invincibility of Soviet tank crews. With great caution, the German soldiers climbed onto the defeated tank and began to carefully inspect it, trying to understand what had happened. To their great surprise, they found only 2 shell holes, while the other 5 88mm shells, for an unknown reason, simply ricocheted off the armor and could not cause any harm. When they tried to open the hatch, the turret unexpectedly began to move again, terrifying them and making them recoil in fear. The dramatic story was brought to an end by a sapper who managed to put a grenade in the hole that was at the bottom of the turret, after which everything finally subsided and silence ensued. The heroism and steadfastness of the Soviet tankers amazed even the Germans, who it would seem could no longer be surprised by anything and who were ready for any trials. And this is quite understandable. The Germans were in a real stupor and shock. They were encountering such behavior of a tank in the USSR for the first time and could not believe what was happening. And this was only the first month of the war, and they did not yet know what awaited them ahead. If on the first day of fighting, they could still hope for the speedy approach of their people. Then on the second day, when everything subsided and the noise of the cannonade subsided in the east, it became completely clear that this was their last battle, a battle to the end, and they would no longer expect help. But they did not flinch and did not give up, but fought to the last breath and to the last drop of blood. As Rouse concludes his detailed story, describing this dramatic situation, deeply moved by this inhuman heroism, we buried them with all military honors, as befits true heroes who gave their lives for their homeland. They fought to their last breath and to the last drop of blood, but this was only one small and tragic drama in this great and bloody war. The heroes were reburied in the military cemetery of the city of Rosinii in 1965. Unfortunately, their names have not been reliably established to this day, although there are several versions and assumptions, but all of them have no documentary confirmation. Goodbye. I was glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to leave your comments. Like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss new and interesting stories.